The doctor told Phineas Hudson on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882 that the woman sitting across the room from him in the Dusty Creek infirmary, the one with the storm-gray eyes and the ink-stained fingers and the proud, unbowed set of her shoulders, would almost certainly outlast him. And Phineas looked across that dusty room at Ada Mercer and said, quietly but with absolute certainty, that he had just found his reason to last. The town of Dusty Creek, Texas, sat at the edge of nowhere and the beginning of everything, wedged between a limestone ridge to the north and a slow brown river to the south that the old-timers called the Mule because it was stubborn and it kicked. It was 1882, and the cattle drives were thinning out as the railroads pushed west, but the land still had teeth, and the men and women who stayed in places like Dusty Creek stayed because they were either too proud to leave or too rooted to pull themselves free. Phineas Hudson was both. He had been a trail rider for the better part of 6 years before a horse threw him outside of Abilene and left him with a lung that never quite healed right. And the doctor in Abilene had told him with the bluntness of a man who charged by the visit that the dust and the wind and the hard riding would finish what the fall had started. Phineas had ridden south instead of listening, because a man who had spent his whole life outdoors does not easily learn to become a man who stays indoors, and he had landed in Dusty Creek the way tumbleweeds land against a fence, not by choice exactly, but because something stopped him there. He had taken work at the Harlan Ranch, doing lighter labor, mending fences, organizing the supply ledgers, tasks that kept him useful without demanding the full force of lungs that creaked like old floorboards when the weather turned cold. The foreman, a stocky man named Garrett Oakes who had a scar through his left eyebrow and a soft spot for men who worked without complaint, had given him the job without asking too many questions, and Phineas had been grateful in the wordless way of a man who did not hand out gratitude cheaply. He was 28 years old. He was lean in the way that illness makes a person lean, not the lean of hard work and good appetite, but the lean of a body quietly consuming its own reserves. His hair was dark and his jaw was sharp, and his eyes were the color of river water over flat stones, a gray-green that could look almost blue in certain lights. He had a way of going still when he was thinking that other people sometimes mistook for coldness, but it was not coldness. It was the stillness of a man who had learned that rushing his thoughts led him to places he regretted. Ada Mercer had come to Dusty Creek 8 months before Phineas arrived, which meant she had enough history in the town to know whose gossip was worth hearing and whose was not, and enough independence built up that she did not need to rely on anyone's approval to feel settled. She had come from Memphis, Tennessee, following a brother who had gone west to open a printing press, and had instead gotten himself killed in a bar dispute over a card game 3 weeks before Ada arrived. She had found the brother's press, the brother's debts, and the brother's half-finished dream, and she had done what a woman of Ada Mercer's particular constitution always did when faced with wreckage. She had rolled up her sleeves and gotten to work. The Dusty Creek Courier was a single-page weekly that Ada now ran alone out of a narrow building, wedged between the general store and the saddle shop. She wrote it, she set the type herself, she ran the press herself, and she delivered it herself, walking the main street every Thursday morning with a stack of papers under her arm and a no-nonsense expression that told people she was not stopping to chat unless the chat was worth stopping for. She was 25 years old, and she had ink under her fingernails almost every day of her life, and she wore her brown hair pinned up under a practical hat, and she had a way of looking at a person that made them feel she was reading something written on the inside of their face. She was also, according to the town doctor, Elias Fern, quietly one of the most iron-constituted people he had ever met. He had said this not as a compliment exactly, but as a medical observation. Ada's lungs were clear, her heart was strong, her blood pressure was steady, her constitution had survived Memphis fever, a brutal overland journey, grief and hard labor without buckling. She went to see Elias Fern twice a year for checkups because she believed in preventative medicine with the same conviction she believed in good typesetting. Do the careful work early, and you avoid the catastrophic mess later. Phineas went to see Elias Fern on that Tuesday in March of 1882 because he had been coughing through the night for 2 weeks, and he could not afford to ignore it any longer. He sat in the wooden chair beside the window in the infirmary's waiting room, and Ada Mercer sat in the chair across from him, there for her regular checkup, and they did not speak at first because the waiting room was small, and the silence between strangers in a small space has its own particular social weight. She was reading a newspaper, not her own, but one from San Antonio, folded into a precise rectangle with the column she was reading facing outward. He noticed the ink on her fingers first, then the focused set of her expression, the slight furrow between her brows that said she was not merely reading but analyzing. He looked away, out the window at the main street where a gray dog was investigating a toppled barrel, and he coughed once into his fist and felt the familiar rough catch in his chest. Ada looked up from her newspaper. She did not say anything immediately. She studied him with those storm-gray eyes for a moment in the way she studied most things directly, without apology, and then she said, "You should ask Elias about willow bark tea. I know it sounds like something a grandmother would recommend, but he has a preparation that actually works for chest complaints." Phineas looked at her. "I appreciate that. I'm not being kind," she said, returning to her newspaper. "I just prefer not to sit in waiting rooms next to men who are about to collapse." He almost smiled. "Noted." They were both called in before another word passed between them, and Phineas sat across from Elias Fern, who was a thin man in his 50s with spectacles and the patient expression of someone who had heard every possible bad news and delivered it anyway, and listened to the doctor explain what was happening inside his chest. The lung, the fall, the dust, the wind. Elias Fern used careful language, the way a person uses careful footing on uncertain ground, but the message was clear enough. Phineas was not dying this week or next month, but he was living in a house with a slow leak, and the question was whether the house would hold or whether it would eventually come down. "The woman who was just here," Phineas said, when Elias had finished and was writing something in his ledger. Elias looked up. "Ada Mercer. She mentioned willow bark tea." "She did she?" Elias almost smiled. "She is in considerably better shape than you, medically speaking. I have been telling her for 2 years that she has the constitution of a woman who will be here long after most people in this town. I told her that again just now." Paused, regarding Phineas with the directness of a man who had learned not to soften the useful truths. "She'll outlast most people in this town, including, I'm sorry to say, yourself, if you're not careful." Phineas walked out of the infirmary into the spring sunshine and found Ada Mercer standing on the boardwalk outside, tucking the San Antonio newspaper into the leather satchel she carried over her shoulder. She looked up when the door opened, and something in his face made her pause. "Bad news?" she asked. "Nothing I didn't already suspect," he said. She nodded once as if that were a satisfactory answer. Then she said, "The willow bark, he told you." He confirmed it. Phineas looked at her in the full light of the morning, the way you cannot look at a person inside a dim room. She had a face that was not conventionally pretty in the soft and decorative way the fashion plates in magazines favored, but it was a face with something better than prettiness. It had character, depth, a quality of absolute presence that made you feel, looking at it, that here was a person who was entirely and stubbornly real. "Dr. Fern tells me you have a very reliable constitution." Ada raised one eyebrow. "Did he say it exactly like that? Very reliable? He said you'd outlast most people in this town." The corner of her mouth moved. "He's been saying that for 2 years. I think he finds it amusing." She settled the strap of the satchel on her shoulder. "He also says I should worry less and sleep more, which I find considerably less reassuring as medical advice." "Why less reassuring?" "Because worrying and not sleeping are what keep the paper running," she said, and she walked down the boardwalk steps and into the main street, and Phineas stood watching her go with the strangest sensation in his chest. Not the rough catch of his damaged lung, but something else entirely. Something that felt uncomfortably like the beginning of something he had not planned for. He went back to the Harlan ranch and mended 2 sections of fence and organized the month's supply ledger. And he thought about her all day with the focused, helpless quality of a man who has tried not to think about something and has failed completely. He found out, in the gradual way you find out things in small towns, that Ada Mercer had been engaged once to a man in Memphis who had decided at the last possible moment that a woman who ran a printing press and had opinions about everything from municipal water rights to the railway company's land grabs was not the woman he had thought she was when he proposed. Ada had, by all accounts, handed back the ring with a composure that impressed everyone who witnessed it, and an expression that made the man feel he had gotten off easier than he deserved. That had been 2 years ago. She had not, since coming to Dusty Creek, given anyone the impression she was looking for a replacement. Phineas was not looking either, or he had not been, which is a different thing entirely. It was Garrett Oakes who gave him the practical nudge, in the indirect way that ranch foremen deliver nudges, by mentioning one afternoon in April that the Dusty Creek Courier was looking for someone to help with deliveries on Thursdays since Ada's regular helper, a 12-year-old boy named Tobias who had been earning a few coins for the work, had gone with his family to Abilene. Phineas said he might look into it, and Garrett gave him a look that said he was not fooling anyone, and Phineas went back to mending a gate latch and decided he would think about it. He did not think about it long. On Wednesday evening he walked to the Courier office, which had a lantern burning in the window at an hour when most business establishments were dark, and knocked on the door frame because the door itself was standing open. Ada looked up from the type case she was standing over, a composing stick in one hand and a look of concentrated focus that shifted when she saw him into something more guarded and questioning. "Phineas Hudson," she said. "From the infirmary." "Yes," he said. "I heard you might need help with deliveries." She studied him for a moment. "I heard you work for Garrett Oakes." "I do. Thursday mornings are free. It's not complicated work." "I'm not looking for complicated," he said. "I'm looking for useful." She considered this with the examining look that he was already beginning to recognize as her default mode of taking in new information. Then she said, "Thursday at 6 in the morning. The papers are ready by then. I pay in coins plus breakfast." "Breakfast?" "Margaret Holloway runs the cookhouse on the east end of Main Street. She feeds the morning workers. If you're helping me by 6, you get a seat at her table at 7. She turned back to her type case. "Don't be late. I hold the press for no one." He was there at 5:55. She was already at the press, pulling the last of the papers, her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her hair pinned efficiently back, moving with the practiced economy of someone who had learned every inch of her own workspace. She handed him the finished stack without preamble, and explained the route 36 subscribers along Main Street and the 3 residential streets running off it, and a further 8 out to the ranches on the eastern edge of town, whose riders came in on Thursdays to pick up their copies from the general store. They walked the route together because Ada always walked it herself, she told him, because hearing what people said when they received the paper was its own kind of research. Phineas carried the papers, and she knocked on doors and exchanged brief, sharp conversations with people who ranged from genuinely pleased to see her to performing a politeness they did not entirely feel, and he watched her navigate all of it with the same unsentimental steadiness, giving nothing away she did not intend to give, collecting everything that was offered. At Margaret Holloway's cookhouse they sat at a long wooden table with 4 other working people from the town, a freighter, 2 ranch hands who had come in overnight with a supply run, and the blacksmith's apprentice, and 8 salt pork and eggs and cornbread that was still warm from the pan. Ada poured herself coffee and picked up a conversation with the freighter about a road washout east of the limestone ridge as naturally as if she had been sitting at that table every morning for years. She had. She had been doing exactly this every Thursday for 8 months. Phineas ate his cornbread and listened to her argue with the freighter about whether the county commissioner could be pressed into funding road repairs before the summer storm season hit, and felt the sensation from the boardwalk outside the infirmary return, that uncomfortably warm, inadvisable feeling of something beginning. After breakfast, walking back toward the courier office, Ada said without looking at him, "You're a good listener." "I'm told it's a fault," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "Who told you that?" "Men who preferred arguing." The corner of her mouth moved again. He was developing a map of that mouth's small movements, the architecture of her near smiles and almost laughter, the way her expressions arrived in small increments rather than all at once. "Well," she said, "in my experience, listening is considerably more useful than arguing. I've printed enough arguments in the paper to know that most of them generate more heat than light." "What do you print instead?" She stopped walking, turned to face him fully with that direct examining gaze. "Facts," she said. "As carefully verified as I can make them. What the county water supply situation actually is, not what 3 men at the saloon believe it is. What the railway company is actually doing with the land north of the ridge, not what their press release claims." She paused. "My brother started this paper because he believed people should be able to trust what they read in it. I intend to keep that true." Phineas looked at her in the warm spring morning, on the unpaved main street of a small Texas town, and something that had been moving slowly in him since Tuesday arrived at a conclusion. "I'll be here next Thursday," he said. "I assumed as much," Ada said, and walked on, and did not look back. But he noticed that her steps had a small particular quality to them that had not been there before, a lightness, just barely, that she might not have been aware of herself. The weeks that followed were a careful, gradual, mutually cautious building of something that neither of them named for a long time. Phineas showed up every Thursday at 5:55 and helped with deliveries, and sat with Ada at Margaret Holloway's table. And somewhere around the 4th Thursday, he also began stopping by the courier office on Tuesdays when the paper was in its busiest stage of preparation. Not to help with the press itself, which Ada ran with a possessiveness he entirely respected, but to help with the physical work that surrounded it, carrying paper stock, moving the supply crates that arrived from San Antonio, repairing the broken shelf in the back room that Ada had been meaning to fix for 6 weeks and had not found the time for. He fixed the shelf on a Tuesday afternoon in late April while Ada sat at her writing desk and worked on her editorial for the week, and the office was quiet except for the scratch of her pen and the sound of his hammer and the wind coming through the open window, and it was one of those rare afternoons where the ordinary elements of a place, the dusty light, the smell of ink, the familiar sounds of work, conspired to feel like something more than ordinary. Ada looked up from her editorial and said, without much preamble, "Why did you come to Dusty Creek?" He set down the hammer. "A horse threw me outside of Abilene, damaged my lung. The doctor there told me hard riding in rough weather would make it worse. I came south looking for drier air and lighter work." He paused. "I stopped here because the foreman at the Harlan Ranch offered me a job without asking me to demonstrate how fast I could work." She was quiet for a moment. "How bad is the lung?" "Bad enough," he said. "Not so bad I can't be useful." "That's not really answering the question." He looked at her steadily. "No, it's not." He sat down on the repaired shelf, testing it with his weight, satisfied when it held firm. "It's a slow problem, not fast. Elias Fern thinks if I keep the dust down, stay off the hard rides in wind, take his preparations, I can manage it for a long time. Maybe a long time is enough." Ada set down her pen. "What does that mean, a long time is enough?" "It means I've been living like I was just passing through," he said. "Since Abilene, since before Abilene if I'm honest. The trail work, the moving around, I was never particularly rooted anywhere. I didn't think I needed to be." He stopped, because what he was about to say felt like considerably more than he had intended to offer, and he was a careful man with what he offered. But Ada was watching him with that full, frank attention, and he found that under that gaze being careful was harder than usual. "I think I was wrong about not needing to be rooted." Ada held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her pen again and looked back at her editorial. "The shelf looks solid," she said, and there was something in her voice, a warmth, carefully contained, that was new. "Thank you." In May, the railway land question became the biggest story the Dusty Creek Courier had ever attempted. The Texas Central Railroad had been quietly filing land claims on parcels north of the Limestone Ridge, parcels that several small ranching families had been grazing on for years without formal title. Not because they were squatters exactly, but because the formal land title system in that part of Texas was a historical tangle of Spanish land grants, Republic of Texas documents, and post-Civil War reassignments that could keep a lawyer busy for years. Ada had been tracking the story since February, corresponding with a lawyer in Austin who was willing to share documents, and a ranchers' association in San Angelo that was fighting a similar battle. In May, she broke the story in the Courier with full documentation of which parcels were being claimed, which families stood to lose their grazing land, and what the legal situation actually was versus what the railroad's local agent, a smooth-spoken man named Cyrus Albright, had been telling people. Cyrus Albright was not pleased. He came to the Courier office on the Friday after the paper ran, which was unusual because most people with complaints came on Thursday when Ada was out on deliveries, and he could pretend he was just leaving a note. Coming on Friday meant he intended a confrontation. He was a tall man with a carefully trimmed mustache and the particular quality of self-possession that belongs to men who are accustomed to having rooms defer to them. He spread Ada's paper on her desk with one finger as if it were evidence at a trial and said, in a tone calibrated to imply she had made a serious error, that several of the document citations in her story were from contested sources, and that the Courier might want to consider a retraction before the situation became more complicated. Ada looked at the finger on her paper, then up at Albright and said, "Which document citations are contested?" Albright said, "The land grant records from the Austin Registry." Ada said, "Those records are public documents from the General Land Office. I received certified copies. Are you telling me the General Land Office is a contested source?" There was a pause. Albright shifted his position and tried a different approach. He said the railroad had significant economic interest in the region, and that a small paper like the Courier might benefit from a more cooperative relationship with its major stakeholders. Ada said, "Are you suggesting the railroad would advertise in the Courier if I retracted a factually accurate story?" Albright said that was not what he was suggesting, with the tone of a man suggesting exactly that. Ada said, "Then I'm not sure what you are suggesting, Mr. Albright, so perhaps you should say it plainly, and we can both respond to the plain version." There was a longer pause. Phineas was in the back room during this exchange, replacing a worn press roller bearing that Ada had asked him to look at, and he had the particular quality of stillness that he used when he was listening carefully and deciding whether to intervene. He did not intervene. He had learned enough about Ada in 2 months to know that intervening would have offended her considerably more than whatever Albright was doing. Albright left without a retraction, and with the expression of a man recalculating his approach. Ada came to the back room doorway when the front door had closed and said, "Roller bearing." "Almost done," Phineas said. "How did it go?" "As expected," she said. She leaned against the door frame and crossed her arms, and something in the set of her jaw told him she was angrier than her voice was letting on. "He implied the paper would have trouble getting supply shipments through if I didn't cooperate. The supply depot is owned by a man who has a contract with the railroad." Phineas set down his wrench. "That's a threat." "It is." She was quiet for a moment. "I know it is. I'm not going to pretend it isn't." She looked at him directly. "I'm also not going to retract a true story." "I know you're not." She looked at him for a moment with something different in her expression, something a little vulnerable under the steadiness, the way a deep river shows its current only in certain lights. "You know, most people in this town think I take unnecessary risks," she said. "The other businesses get along by not disturbing things." "You're not most businesses," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not." And then more quietly, almost to herself, "My brother knew that. He used to say the press was either a torch or a mirror, and a mirror in the dark is useless." Phineas was very still. He was right. Ada looked at him for a long moment. Then she straightened from the door frame and said briskly, "Finish the roller bearing. I need to press the next issue by Tuesday." But she said it with a warmth that was entirely different from the brisk efficiency of the words, and he turned back to the bearing with the feeling that something had crossed a threshold. The supply problem solved itself, more or less, through the stubbornness of the ranching community. The families whose land was being threatened by the railroad's claims had read the Courier story with attention, and 3 of them, including old Des Portillo, who had been ranching that stretch of ridge country since 1865, and had papers to prove it going back further than that, came into town and offered to bring Ada's paper supplies in their own wagons when they made their monthly town runs. It was not a perfect solution, but it was the kind of solution that happens in small places where people remember who stood up for them, and the railroad's leverage over Ada's supply chain disappeared quietly without any further threats from Cyrus Albright, who had apparently recalculated and decided a conspicuous fight with a newspaper was not worth the attention it would draw. In June, Phineas had a bad week with his lung. The weather turned. A dry, hot wind came down off the plateau to the north and carried the fine gray dust that the limestone breaks generated when the wind was right, and he spent 3 days coughing in a way that was worse than usual and left him wrung out and hollow feeling in the evenings. He did not tell Ada about it directly, but she came by the Harlan Ranch on the Thursday of that week, a Thursday, when she had no deliveries because the paper was already out and distributed, which was unusual enough that Garrett Oakes raised his eyebrow as she rode in on the bay mare she kept at the livery. She brought Elias Fern's willow bark preparation and a covered pot of broth from Margaret Holloway's cookhouse and sat in the chair by the bunk room window, while Phineas drank the broth and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been caught being unwell and is not sure how to receive the attention. "How did you know?" he asked. "Tom Ridley saw you at the water pump Wednesday morning and said you looked like something the wind had left behind," she said. "Tom Ridley tells me things. He thinks I'm writing about the water pump situation." "Are you?" "Yes," she said, "but I also pay attention to other things." She poured the bark preparation into the cup he had emptied and handed it back. "Drink the rest of this." He drank it. It was bitter and he did not complain about it. "You didn't have to come." "No," she agreed, folding her hands in her lap and looking at him steadily. "I did not have to." He looked at her. The afternoon light through the bunk room window was long and golden, the particular light of a June evening in Texas that turns everything it touches the color of old honey, and Ada in that light was, he could not finish the thought in practical language. She was the person he had been counting on seeing every Thursday morning for 3 months. She was the person whose opinions he had been carrying around in his head all week between Thursdays. She was the person Elias Fern had described as someone who would outlast most people in this town, and Phineas, who had spent 4 years since the accident in Abilene moving through his days with the muted quality of a man who was managing his time rather than living it, felt with sudden and alarming clarity that he did not want to manage his time anymore. He wanted to fill it. He wanted to fill it with Thursday mornings and ink-stained fingers and arguments about county commissioners and broth in a covered pot and that careful, examining gaze that saw straight through to the thing you actually meant. "Ada," he said. She looked at him with the full attention that was the most characteristic thing about her. "I'd like to take you for a ride," he said. "When I'm better. The ridge country north of town before the railroad gets any further into it. I know a section that Des Portillo showed me last month. up above the cedar breaks where you can see all the way to the river bend. I'd like to show you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been meaning to see it, for a piece I'm writing on the land claims geography." "Yes," he said. "I thought it might be useful for the piece." "Very practical," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved, and this time it was not almost a smile but an actual one, and it changed her whole face, made it open and warm and younger somehow, and he thought he would carry that smile with him for a considerable number of days. "Very practical," he agreed. She went back to town before dark, and he finished the willow bark preparation and felt, despite the aching in his chest, considerably better than he had all week. They rode north to the ridge on a Saturday in late June, Ada on the bay mare, and Phineas on a steady roan gelding that Garrett Oaks lent him without comment, taking the old trail that wound up through the cedar and live oak before breaking out onto the limestone shelf above the tree line. It was a clear day with enough breeze to move the heat around without making it unpleasant, and the country up on the ridge was exactly what Phineas had promised: open and enormous and beautiful in the spare, geological way of Texas plateau country. The sky an impossible blue above the pale gray stone, the river bend glittering far below to the south like a dropped coin. Ada sat her horse at the top of the ridge and looked at it all in silence for a long time, and Phineas sat beside her and did not say anything because some things earn silence. Then she said softly, "My brother would have printed this view if a press could print a view." "What was he like?" Phineas asked. She was quiet for another moment. "Loud," she said, "in the best way. Loud and interested in everything and terrible at cards, which is why he ended up in that bar on that particular night. He went to win back money he had lost earlier in the week, and instead got into a dispute with a man who had even less patience than good cards. And that was Thomas Mercer." Her voice was even, but he could hear the grief in it, the old steady weight of it, the kind that has become familiar rather than acute. "He left me the press and a stack of debts and half a stack of ambitions, and I have been doing my best with all of it." "You've done more than your best," Phineas said. She looked at him. The wind moved a loose strand of her hair across her face, and she tucked it back without taking her eyes off him. "You're very certain of that?" "I am," he said. "I read the paper." She almost laughed, a real laugh, brief and surprised and genuine, and he stored it alongside the smile as something to carry. "You read the paper," she repeated, "every word." "Including the notices about the county water board, which are admittedly not the most riveting reading." "The water board is extremely important," she said, with mock dignity, and then laughed again. And this time the laugh did not stop quickly but ran on, and he laughed with her, and the two of them sat their horses on the limestone ridge above Dusty Creek and laughed in the enormous blue Texas afternoon, and something that had been carefully in process for 3 months arrived at its completion. They rode back down the ridge in the late afternoon in a different kind of silence. Not the silence of two people being careful around each other, but the silence of two people who have said something important and are living inside the weight of it. At the edge of the cedar breaks, where the trail narrowed between two large rocks and they had to ride single file, Phineas reached across from his saddle and took Ada's hand briefly, just for a moment, and she looked at him with those storm-gray eyes and let him hold it for that moment before the trail widened again and they rode apart, and neither of them said anything about it, but both of them knew that something had been decided. The summer of 1882 in Dusty Creek was long and hot in the way that Texas summers are long and hot, relentlessly, gloriously, without apology. Phineas managed his lung through it with Elias Fern's preparations, and by doing his outdoor work in the cooler mornings and evenings, and Ada managed the paper through it with the same combination of focused stubbornness and practical intelligence that she brought to everything, publishing stories about the railroad land issue that were being picked up and reprinted in San Antonio and Austin papers, which brought the Courier a small but meaningful increase in paid subscriptions from readers outside Dusty Creek, who had their own reasons to follow the story. They were together most Thursdays and Tuesdays, and increasingly on Saturdays, walking the town or riding the ridge country or sitting in the courier office in companionable parallel work, while Ada wrote and Phineas read or mended whatever practical thing needed mending. They ate at Margaret Holloway's cookhouse and at Des Portillo's table when the old rancher invited the townspeople out for his quarterly barbacoa, and once at the home of Garrett Oakes and his wife Clara, who served the best beef stew in the county, and who exchanged a glance over the table when Ada and Phineas argued companionably about the relative merits of the county's two road engineers that had the quality of two people watching something they had expected arrive. It was Clara Oakes who said to Phineas, on the porch after supper while Ada was inside helping with the dishes. Clara Oakes was a direct woman who had been married to Garrett for 15 years and had opinions. She is not easy, you know. She will always put the paper first and the story first and what she believes is right first, and a man who thought he was marrying a woman who would make him the center of her world would be in for a significant disappointment. Phineas said, I know. Clara said, and you don't mind that. Phineas said, I would find it considerably more alarming if she were willing to put me at the center of her world. It would mean she was someone other than who she is. Clara regarded him with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose assessment has been confirmed. Good, she said, and went back inside. In August, the railroad situation sharpened again. The Texas Central's legal team filed an injunction in the Bexar County Court that would freeze the land claims dispute while the railroad's title arguments were reviewed, which meant that the ranching families could not proceed with their own title documentation while the freeze was in effect. A tactic, Ada wrote with barely contained fury in the Courier, designed to run out the clock on families who could not afford to wait years for legal resolution, while the railroad could afford to wait indefinitely. The Austin lawyer, whose name was Robert Calhoun, came to Dusty Creek in person in late August to consult with the ranching families and with Ada, and he sat in the Courier office one long afternoon, with maps and documents spread across Ada's desk, while Ada and Phineas and Des Portillo and two other ranchers, a woman named Sarah Vila, who had been grazing the west section of Ridge Country since her husband's death in 1878, and a younger rancher named Marcus Flood, who had bought his parcel through a Republic of Texas title that Calhoun believed was airtight, worked through the legal situation county record by county record. Calhoun was a precise man of about 40 with the particular alertness of a lawyer who enjoys a fight he believes is winnable. He said the injunction was beatable on procedural grounds and that the General Land Office records Ada had already published in the Courier were going to be important exhibits. He said the case would take time, probably until the following spring, but that the ranching families had a strong position if they could hold together and afford the filing fees. The filing fees were, it turned out, the problem. Not ruinous, but more than the individual ranchers could easily manage along with their normal operating costs. Ada looked at the number Calhoun wrote down and then at the ranchers, and then she said, what if the Courier ran a public fund for the filing costs? Subscriptions designated specifically for the Legal Defense Fund, with full accounting published in every issue. Calhoun said that was a creative approach. Des Portillo said he trusted Ada to keep the accounting honest, which from Des Portillo, who had been in Texas long enough to trust almost no one who had not proven it through years of consistent behavior, was a considerable statement. Sarah Vila said she thought her neighbors further east might contribute if they understood the precedent. If the railroad could take Ridge Country land on contested titles, they could take any land on a contested title, and there was a great deal of contested title land in West Texas. Marcus Flood said he was in. By October, the Courier's Legal Defense Fund had raised enough to cover all the filing fees and leave a working reserve, drawn from subscribers as far away as Laredo who had read Ada's coverage in the San Antonio papers and understood the stakes. Robert Calhoun filed the counterarguments in Bexar County Court in November, and the judge, to Cyrus Albright's visible displeasure, agreed to consider the procedural challenge to the injunction and set a hearing date for March. Through all of this, through the hot summer and the busy fall, Ada and Phineas moved closer in the particular way of two people who are both careful with themselves incrementally, deliberately, with a quality of accumulated certainty rather than sudden declaration. He brought her coffee on Tuesday mornings when she was deep in the week's writing. She brought him Elias Fern's preparations on the weeks when the weather was bad, and she could tell from a glance at him that his chest was working harder than it should be. He was there the night the press roller broke completely, a Tuesday in September, 11 at night, with the Wednesday overnight press run completely stalled, and they spent 3 hours taking the press apart and reassembling it with a replacement part that had been sitting in the supply room waiting for exactly this emergency, working side by side in the lamplit office with their sleeves rolled up and ink on both of them. And when the press ran again, Ada made a sound of such pure relief and satisfaction that Phineas, without thinking about it, pulled her into a brief and wholly genuine embrace. She went still for a moment, the stillness of a person recalibrating, and then she put her arms around him and held on, and they stood like that in the ink-smelling office with the press running behind them, and the embrace lengthened past the brief and practical into something else, something that was about more than relief at a fixed press. Ada said into his shoulder, "You stayed." He said, "I wasn't going anywhere." She pulled back and looked at him, and her expression was entirely open in a way he had never seen it, without the guarded quality that was her default, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back with such wholehearted directness that it felt less like a first kiss than a confirmation of something that had already been known for a long time. After that, they did not pretend they were only colleagues or only friends, which saved them and everyone around them a considerable amount of pretending. Margaret Holloway acted as though this development was as inevitable as the weather, and served them both extra cornbread. Clara Oakes gave Ada a long look of approval and told Garrett she had been right from the beginning. Des Portillo shook Phineas's hand with the grave sincerity of a man who had known Ada since she arrived in Dusty Creek and was relieved she had found someone whose judgment he could respect. Elias Fern said nothing but smiled into his ledger when they came in together for Phineas's November checkup. Elias' checkup in November was cautiously encouraging. The lung had not worsened. The preparations were managing the inflammation. The key, Elias said, as he always said, was the dust and the wind and the hard riding. Avoiding them was the most important thing. Phineas said he had been doing that. Ada, sitting in the chair she had stopped pretending she was not going to sit in when Phineas came to the infirmary, said he had been very good about it except for 1 week in October when he rode in wind because Garrett needed an urgent message delivered, and Phineas said that had been necessary. And Ada said that was exactly the problem. Necessary was how a man talked himself into the things that did the quiet damage. And Elias Fern looked between the two of them with an expression that was pure, undisguised delight, and said that Ada's understanding of preventive care was, medically speaking, better than many doctors he had met. November brought the first cold, and with it, the annual question of firewood, which in Dusty Creek was something of a communal undertaking, because the cedar breaks on the ridge provided the best firewood, and reaching them required either a long ride or coordinated wagon trips. Phineas organized a trip with Garrett and 3 of the Harlan Ranch hands, and Ada came along not to cut wood but because she was writing a piece on the cedar break ecosystem, and the ways the railroad's land activity was affecting the drainage patterns that fed the cedar growth, and because she went where the stories were. She rode beside Phineas up the ridge trail in the cold November light, and they talked about the piece she was writing and the court hearing scheduled for March, and about a letter she had received from Robert Calhoun that suggested the judge was taking the procedural challenge seriously. At the top of the ridge, while Garrett and the hands worked the cedar with axes, Ada sat on a limestone outcrop with her notebook and wrote, and Phineas sat beside her and looked out at the country below, the town small and orderly in the valley, the brown river coiling south, the sky pale and enormous above it all, and felt with a steady, uncomplicated conviction that this was where he was meant to be. Not on a trail drive, not moving between nowhere and nowhere with a bedroll and an uncertain future. Here, in this particular landscape, in this particular town, next to this particular woman who was writing in her notebook with such focused intensity that she had forgotten he was there, or rather had included him in the landscape of her concentration in the way you include things that are simply part of where you are. He said, quietly, so as not to break the flow of what she was writing, "Ada." She did not look up, but she said, "I'm listening. I want to ask you something." She finished the sentence she was writing because she always finished the sentence and then looked up. The cold had put color in her face and the light turned her gray eyes almost silver. "Ask," she said. He had thought about this, as he thought about most important things carefully and from multiple angles, and he had arrived at the conviction that what he felt did not need elaborate framing. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you'll have me. I know what the practical situation is with my lung and with what Elias has told us. I know you'll probably outlast me by many years, and I know you know that too. I'm asking anyway because the practical situation is not the only thing that matters and because I'd rather spend whatever time I have being certain about something than spend it being careful about nothing." Ada looked at him for a long time. The wind moved across the limestone and neither of them spoke. Then she said, "Elias told you I'd outlast you. He did, in so many words. And you're asking me anyway." "I'm asking you because of it," he said, "not in spite of it. Because someone told me that and I looked at you and I thought, there is a reason to last. There is a reason to do more than manage the time I have left, if you'll let me try to deserve you." Her expression went through several things very quickly, the examining, the guarded, the calculating, and then settled into something entirely different, something open and certain and warm and real. She said, "You already deserve me, Phineas. You have for months. I've just been waiting for you to say it plainly." He laughed, a real, surprised laugh. "You were waiting. I told you at the beginning, I prefer plain speech." She closed her notebook and looked at him with that full, present, entirely real attention. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." They were married in March of 1883, 4 days before the Bexar County hearing on the railroad injunction, because Ada was not willing to miss the hearing for a honeymoon, and Phineas said that was entirely characteristic of her, and he would not have it any other way. The ceremony was held in the open air because the small church in Dusty Creek had a ceiling that leaked in wet weather and March had been wet, and it was performed by the circuit preacher who came through once a month, a stout, good-natured man named Brother Aldous, who had a voice built for carrying across open ground, and who married them in front of nearly the entire town at the east end of Main Street, with the limestone ridge visible behind them in the pale March sun. Ada wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that made her eyes look entirely gray, and she kept her hands absolutely still during the ceremony with the focus of a woman who did not want anyone to see how moved she was, but her hands were never entirely still, and Phineas, holding them, felt them trembling just slightly, and he held them more firmly, and she looked at him with an expression that said she knew he had noticed and was grateful he had not said anything. He said his vows in a clear, quiet voice, and meant every word of them with the particular weight of a man who has thought about time and knows it is not unlimited. She said hers in a voice that was steady until the last line and then wavered just once, just briefly, and then steadied again. And when Brother Aldous pronounced them married, she kissed him with a firmness that made several people in the assembled town laugh with affection. Garrett Oakes said, at the celebration afterward at Margaret Holloway's cookhouse, that he had never in his life watched a woman more thoroughly choose a person than Ada had chosen Phineas, and he meant it as the high compliment it was. Clara Oakes agreed, and added that the man had been worth choosing, and Des Portillo gave a toast in Spanish that no one entirely understood, but that was clearly warm and sincere, and that made Sarah Vila, standing beside him, wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. 4 days later, Robert Calhoun stood before the Bexar County judge and argued the procedural challenge to the railroad's injunction with the organized precision of a man who had spent 6 months preparing. Ada sat in the courtroom gallery with her notebook, not covering the hearing for the paper. She had arranged for Calhoun to provide her with a full transcript, but present because she had been part of the fight from the beginning, and she intended to be present at the outcome. Phineas sat beside her. The judge, a deliberate man named Honorable James T. Weld, who gave no indication during the hearing of which way he was leaning, took 2 weeks to deliver his decision. On a Thursday morning in late March, Ada was printing the week's Courier when the messenger from the Bexar County Court arrived with the written decision. She read it standing at the press, still wearing her working apron, and then she sat down on the stool beside the typecase and was very quiet for a moment. Phineas was there. He was almost always there on Tuesdays and Thursdays now, the ranch work and the paper work having settled into a rhythm that accommodated both, and he watched her face. "The injunction is lifted," Ada said. "The railroad's procedural filing was found to be deficient. The ranchers can proceed with their title documentation." He came and stood beside her and read over her shoulder. "That's a significant win." "It is." She looked up at him. "It's not the end. The railroad will file again differently, and this will probably go on for years in the courts. But the families can move forward now, and Calhoun says the General Land Office records we published have been formally entered into the record, which makes them much harder for the railroad to contest." "You built the foundation for that," he said. She shook her head, but not dismissively, more in the way of a person who is distributing the credit accurately. "Thomas built the foundation. He built the press. I just kept it going in the direction he intended." She paused, looking down at the decision document. "I think he would have been very pleased about this." Phineas put his hand on her shoulder. She put her hand over his. The spring of 1883 settled into a warmth that was different from the previous springs Phineas had known in Dusty Creek, not different in climate. The limestone ridge was the same, and the slow brown river was the same, and the enormous sky was the same, but different in the quality of his experience of it, which was the difference between being a traveler passing through a landscape and being a person who lives inside it. He had moved into the rooms above the Courier office in March, the practical solution for 2 people whose work kept them both attached to the press and the ranch. Though as the weeks passed it became clearer that his attachment to the ranch was evolving into something more part-time, while his involvement in the Courier's operations deepened in the ways that his practical skills made useful. He could not write as Ada could write, and he did not pretend to be able to, but he could manage the mechanical operation of the press with a competence that freed Ada to spend more of her time on what she did best, which was finding the stories and making them clear. Elias Fern's spring checkup on Phineas's lung was the best one yet. "Stable," Elias said, which in the context of a lung that had been declared a slow problem was excellent news. The willow bark preparation, the avoidance of the worst winds, the drier air of the ridge country versus the Abilene plains, it was all contributing. Elias said, in the careful language he used for good news as well as bad, that there was every reason to think careful management could maintain the lung's current status for a long time. Not indefinitely. He was always honest about that, but a long time. Ada walked out of the infirmary and into the spring sunshine, and took Phineas's arm as they stepped off the boardwalk into the street, and she held it with the easy sureness of someone who has stopped calculating whether to reach and simply reaches. And Phineas covered her hand with his, and they walked down the main street of Dusty Creek in the morning light, past the general store, and the saddle shop, and the cookhouse where Margaret Holloway was hanging washing on the line behind the building. Past the small spaces and the ordinary life of the town that had stopped them both from moving on, for different reasons and at different times, and that had turned out to be the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for. Summer came with its heat, and its long days, and the particular gold light of the Texas afternoon that Phineas had come to think of as the light of his actual life, as opposed to the muted versions of life he had been living before. He rode the ridge with Ada on Saturdays when the paper was put to bed and the week's work was done, and they sat on the limestone outcrop above the cedar breaks and watched the country turn color in the evening, and talked about everything: the paper and the court case and the county water situation, and Clara Oak's views on the proper raising of children and Des Portillo's opinions about the changing cattle market, and all the smaller daily things that make up the texture of a shared life. In August, Ada told him she was pregnant, standing at the press in the early morning with the particular directness she brought to every significant announcement, and then watched his face with the careful attention of a person measuring a response. His face went through surprise and then a deep, steady, unqualified joy that was so plain and uncomplicated that Ada, who was often moved by what was complex and rarely by what was simple, found her eyes filling without having expected to. She blinked it back, and he came to her and held her face in his hands with a gentleness that was the most careful thing about him, which was already a careful man, and said, "Ada," and nothing else, because her name said the rest of it. She said, "Elias says I'm in excellent health." The composure returned almost immediately, overlaid on the warmth rather than replacing it. "He says there is no reason to expect any complications." "Of course there is no reason," Phineas said. "You have a reliable constitution." She laughed, the real, unguarded laugh, and put her hands over his on her face. "He also says I should worry less and sleep more. He's been saying that for 3 years. And I have been ignoring it for 3 years and been perfectly fine." She looked up at him with those clear gray eyes. "I'll try harder this time. I make no guarantees, but I'll try." The pregnancy was, in keeping with Ada's constitution, efficient and uncomplicated, which Ada took as a personal vindication, and Elias Fern took as exactly what he had predicted. The Courier continued to publish every Thursday. The press continued to run. Ada's editorials became, if anything, more sharply argued in the final months of her pregnancy, as if the physical energy that could not go into riding the ridge and walking the full delivery route found its outlet in language instead. The story she ran in November about the county's failure to maintain the East Road, the road the freighter had complained about at Margaret Holloway's table 2 years earlier, which had now deteriorated to the point where supply wagons were losing wheels in the ruts, resulted in a direct response from the county commissioner and a promised repair budget, which Ada reported on in the following issue with a satisfaction that she did not entirely conceal. A son was born in the first days of March 1884, at sunrise on a Tuesday, which Ada said was entirely appropriate given that Tuesday was the most important working day of the Courier's week. They named him Thomas for Ada's brother, and the name was given with the gravity of an act of memory and the lightness of genuine hope, which is the combination that the best names carry. Phineas held Thomas in the morning light of the room above the Courier office, and felt something that he could not have named before he had lived it, not merely love, which he already knew, but a quality of absolute commitment to the future, to the continuation of things, to the long work of building something that outlasts the builder. He had been told Ada would outlast him, and it remained true, and he had made his peace with it in a way that was not resignation, but was instead a kind of freedom. Knowing that the things you love will continue does not make them less yours. It makes them more real. Little Thomas was a solid, observant baby who looked at the world with the same measuring gray eyes he had inherited from his mother, and who slept with a focused determination that his parents found deeply funny and somewhat reassuring. He was rolled in his small blanket behind the press on Thursdays while Ada ran the paper, which Elias Fern had opinions about regarding the ink fumes, but Thomas showed no signs of objecting, and Ada showed no signs of changing her operations, and a compromise was reached involving an open window and a cloth screen that kept the worst of the press particulate away from the baby's corner, which satisfied Elias enough to stop arguing about it. Des Portillo came to see the baby with the gravity of a man paying respects to something important, and held Thomas with a care that was surprising and touching in a man of such weathered exterior, and said something quietly in Spanish that Ada asked him to translate. He said he had told the baby that the land his parents had helped protect was the land his grandchildren would also stand on, and that was the only kind of future worth making. Ada thanked him with a depth of sincerity that was unusual for her public manner, and Des Portillo nodded once and handed the baby back to Phineas, and left with the dignity of a man who has said the right thing and does not need it expanded upon. The railroad case wound through the courts in the long, complicated way of land disputes in that era, with filings and counterfilings and postponements and hearings, and Robert Calhoun, who had become something of a quarterly visitor to Dusty Creek, appeared at each stage with his maps and his documents and his focused certainty. In June of 1884, the Bixar County Court issued a preliminary ruling in favor of the ranching families on the western section, Sarah Vila's parcel and 2 neighboring parcels, and the railroad, faced with the prospect of a full trial on the remaining sections that would require producing documents they apparently preferred not to produce in open court, entered into a negotiation with Robert Calhoun's clients that resulted, by September, in a formal agreement returning the contested parcels to their longtime grazers with clear title documentation. It was not the complete defeat of the railroad's ambitions in the area. The Texas Central continued to operate and continued to pursue expansion with the same tools it always used, but it was a real and significant outcome for the specific families who had been at risk, and Ada published the final resolution on the front page of the October Courier under a headline that said title restored in the largest type she had. With a full account of the 3 years of legal work and the role of the community fund and the names of every person who had contributed, printed in full as she had promised from the beginning. She wrote at the bottom of the piece a brief editorial note that said the press existed to make the truth visible, and the truth would always eventually be stronger than the injunction, and she meant it as a statement of principle as much as a commentary on the specific case. Cyrus Albright left Dusty Creek in November of that year, transferred to another posting, and the railroad's local operation was taken over by a younger agent who had apparently been briefed on the Courier situation, and who confined himself to factual press releases and did not suggest retractions. Thomas Hudson took his first steps in December of 1884. Crossing the floor of the room above the Courier office from the chair leg, he was using as an anchor toward his father's outstretched hands, with an expression of such concentrated determination and barely contained pride that both his parents laughed and then stopped laughing almost immediately in order not to distract him. And he completed the 5 steps and fell into Phineas's hands with the solidity of a small person who has accomplished something important and knows it. Phineas lifted him and held him and looked over his son's head at Ada, who was leaning against the door frame with her arms crossed and her face entirely open in that particular way it went when she had stopped performing composure and was simply feeling the thing directly, and he said, "He has your determination." Ada said, "He has your timing. You always wait until you're certain before you move." Thomas patted Phineas's face with both hands with the authority of a child who has earned the attention, and Phineas pressed his forehead against his son's small forehead and breathed in the particular warm smell of him, and felt the future extending forward in a direction that was clear and good and real. In the spring of 1885, Elias Fern's checkup on Phineas was again stable. 3 years of consistent management. 3 years of the preparations and the careful habits and the avoidance of the worst conditions. Elias said, with the measured optimism that was the most he allowed himself in such assessments, that the situation was as good as it could reasonably be expected to be, and that he saw no reason the current stability could not continue with continued care. Phineas said he had no intention of being careless. Elias said he knew that, and that Ada's management of the situation was, medically speaking, extremely thorough. Ada, who was in the examination room as she was now always in the examination room for Phineas's appointments, said she was simply paying attention, and Elias said yes, that was exactly it. Walking home from the infirmary on that spring morning, Thomas between them holding both their hands, swinging between their arms with the pure physical joy of a 14-month-old who has recently mastered walking and considers it the greatest invention in human history, Ada said, "Elias told me something else today, before you came in." Phineas looked at her. "Something about you." "About us," she said. "About the family." She lifted Thomas's arm on the arc of a swing and he crowed with delight. He confirmed what I already suspected. By autumn, Thomas will have a sibling. Phineas stopped walking and looked at her and felt the same clean, uncomplicated joy as the first time, not less for being repeated but more, because he knew now the full shape of what it meant, the actual weight and texture of the life that was being described. "Ada," he said. "I'm in excellent health," she said immediately, with the particular preemptive precision of a woman who knows how her husband worries and addresses it directly. Elias said exactly that. Excellent health. Reliable constitution. "He's been saying that for 4 years, Phineas said. "And he has been right for 4 years, she said, and picked Thomas up from the street when he tried to investigate a horse's water trough that was well above his reach, and settled him on her hip with the ease of a woman who has spent 14 months becoming entirely accustomed to carrying a small person, and looked at Phineas with those clear and certain gray eyes. He took her free hand. They walked the rest of the way home like that, the three of them in the morning light of the main street of Dusty Creek, past the general store and the saddle shop and the cookhouse, where Margaret Holloway saw them from her window and registered the expression on both their faces, and turned to tell her helper that she thought congratulations were probably in order. The second child came in October, a girl, born in the late afternoon with the long October light coming through the bedroom window, delivered by Elias Fern with his habitual efficient calm, and received by her parents with the particular astonishment that belongs to the second child too, because knowing what to expect does not entirely prepare you for the fact of it arriving. They named her Clara, for Clara Oakes, who had said the right things and done the right things from the beginning, and who came to see the baby on the second day, and held her with the expression of a woman who is entirely pleased to have done something worthy of being remembered this way. Thomas, 14 months old and deeply interested in everything in his environment, investigated his sister with the focused curiosity of a child who has been told this was an important development and intends to take it seriously. He touched her hand with one careful finger, and she gripped it with the blind, instinctive strength of a newborn, and Thomas looked up at his parents with an expression of complete astonishment, and then back at his sister with something that was already, unmistakably, the beginning of a lifetime of loyalty. Phineas sat on the edge of the bed beside Ada that evening, with Clara sleeping in the cradle and Thomas asleep on the floor rug, where he had settled himself at some point in the afternoon, and no one had wanted to disturb. And Ada's head was on his shoulder and her eyes were almost closed with the deep, whole-body tiredness of a woman who has done something enormous. And the office below them was quiet with the press at rest. And the October wind was moving outside in the way of a wind that has just turned cold for the season. "I have been thinking," Ada said very quietly into his shoulder. "About what?" "About what Elias said, 4 years ago, that I would outlast most people in this town." She paused. "I used to think that was just a medical fact, a statement about constitution. I did not understand at the time that it could be a reason for anything except perhaps a kind of loneliness." He was very still. "And now," she lifted her head and looked at him in the dim lamplight of the room, "now I think it means I have more time to fill," she said, "more years to put in the ledger, and I want to fill them with this." With you and Thomas and Clara and the paper and the Ridge Country and Margaret Holloway's cornbread and Des Portillo's quarterly barbacoa and Elia's fern telling me to worry less and sleep more. She paused again. I want to fill them with all of it. He looked at her. This woman with the storm-gray eyes and the ink-stained fingers and the absolute stubbornness of someone who believes the truth is worth the trouble of printing it, and felt with a certainty that was entirely different from the certainty he had felt that Tuesday morning in the infirmary, when a doctor had told him she would outlast him, and he had looked across the room and found his reason to last, felt now a certainty that was not about the future at all but about the present. About the fact that all the future he had managed to build had been built in this moment and this room and this particular life. Yes, he said, all of it. She put her head back on his shoulder, and his hand found her hand in the lamplight, and Thomas slept on the floor rug, and Clara breathed the steady small breath of a new person, and the press waited below for Tuesday, and the paper waited to be written, and the Ridge Country waited outside in the night. And Dusty Creek went on being Dusty Creek, small and ordinary, and built on the accumulated acts of the people who had chosen to stay in it. And everything was exactly as it should be. The years that followed were the kind of years that a person understands in retrospect, when the whole shape of a life has become visible. At the time they were simply the years, the ordinary complicated days of work and weather and children, and the slow evolution of the town around them. Thomas grew into a boy who had his mother's gray eyes and his father's quality of careful stillness, and who learned to set type by the age of 6 with a seriousness that made Ada look at him, sometimes with a private expression of pure and almost disbelieving joy. Clara grew into a girl of such decided opinions and such physical fearlessness. She was riding the bay mare's successor, a steady gray, by the time she was 5 and demanding to be taken up the Ridge Trail by 6, that Phineas occasionally looked at her and saw, with a mixture of affection and resigned amusement, a set of characteristics he recognized entirely. The Dusty Creek Courier grew too. Slowly, steadily, in the way of things that are built on a solid foundation rather than ambition alone, more subscribers, more pages on occasion when the news warranted it, a reputation in the region as a paper that printed what was true rather than what was convenient. Ada hired a helper in 1887, a young woman named Petra Delgado from a ranching family east of town, who had an instinct for the work and a quickness, with the type case that impressed Ada within the first 2 weeks, and whose presence gave Ada for the first time in years a genuine day off on Sundays, that she mostly spent riding the ridge with Phineas and ignoring Elia's Fern's recommendation to rest. The railway land case that had been the great story of 1882 had settled by 1884, but the broader issues it represented: land rights, corporate overreach, the relationship between the law and the people who lived outside the major cities and had the least access to its protections, remained the kind of stories Ada returned to throughout the decade, in different forms and in different corners of the region. She corresponded with lawyers and journalists and political figures from her desk in the Courier office, and letters arrived from addresses all over Texas and beyond with information and tips, and the particular kind of trust that a publication earns when it demonstrates year after year that it will use information responsibly. Phineas continued to manage the press mechanics and the supply logistics and the physical operations of the paper, and continued his part-time work at the Harlan Ranch in the seasons when the ranch needed extra hands for lighter work, though as the years passed and Thomas grew old enough to be genuinely useful, father and son worked increasingly alongside each other in both places. And the ranch work and the press work began to feel less like 2 separate obligations and more like 2 aspects of the same life rooted in the same piece of country. His lung remained stable. Not cured, Elia's Fern was consistent, and honest that stable was not cured but stable, managed, not getting worse. Year after year of Elia's preparations and dry air, and the absence of the worst dust and the worst wind. Year after year of Ada's thorough attention to the practical business of keeping him well had kept the slow problem slow. He was 35 in 1889, and his chest creaked in cold weather, and he could not ride hard in a north wind without paying for it the next day. But he was here, present, alive in the full sense of the word, rooted in a place and a life that felt entirely and honestly his. Elias Fern retired from medicine in 1890, at the age of 68, turning his practice over to a younger doctor named Helena Morse, who had trained in San Antonio and who arrived in Dusty Creek with a medical bag, a set of updated preparations, and a direct manner that Ada approved of immediately. Elias himself remained in Dusty Creek and became, in his retirement, a reliable presence at Margaret Holloway's breakfast table and a valued subscriber to the Courier, which he read with the attention of a man who has always paid close attention to the health of things. His retirement checkup on Phineas was the last one he performed personally, and he did it with the same quiet precision that had characterized every one of the preceding 8 years of checkups, and at the end of it he folded his hands on his desk and looked at Phineas with the expression of a man summing up something that has taken longer than expected to reach its conclusion. "The lung," Elias said, "is as it was, stable, managed. I told you 8 years ago it was a slow problem. It has remained a slow problem. Dr. Morse will take excellent care of you going forward." He paused. "I also told you, 8 years ago, that Ada Mercer would outlast most people in this town. I stand by that assessment." Another pause, and now the expression was something more than clinical, something that had the warmth in it of an old man looking at something he is glad to have had some small part in. "You told me then that you had found your reason to last. I believe that has proven to be accurate," Phineas said, "more accurate than I could have understood at the time." "Yes," Elias said, "that is usually how it works with the important things." They shook hands with the firmness of two men who respect each other, and Phineas walked out into the Dusty Creek Main Street, the same Main Street, the same boardwalks, the same gray dog's descendants investigating the same overturned barrels, though it was all different too, all layered now with 8 years of living. And Ada was waiting outside with Clara beside her, because Clara at the age of 5 refused to wait indoors for anything when outdoors was an available option. And Thomas was not there because Thomas at the age of 6 had a particular Tuesday commitment to the type case that he defended with the same focus his mother defended the press. Clara said, "Is Dr. Fern retiring today?" "He is," Phineas said, crouching down to her level. Clara considered this. "Who will check you now?" "Dr. Morse." "She is very good," Clara said, with the authority of a 5-year-old who has assessed the situation. "She let me look at her stethoscope." Ada caught Phineas's eye over Clara's head with a look that was entirely alive with the particular fond exasperation and deep warmth that belonged to 7 years of marriage and 2 children, and a life built together. And he looked back at her with everything he had learned to say in that look. The gratitude and the love and the daily, accumulated certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is and is glad of it. "Come on," Ada said, taking Clara's hand. "Thomas will eat all the cornbread if we are not at Margaret's table by 7. Clara seized her mother's hand with both of hers and began pulling her down the boardwalk steps with the physical urgency of a child for whom cornbread constituted a genuine emergency, and Ada let herself be pulled, laughing, and Phineas followed them down the steps and into the morning. The main street of Dusty Creek in the morning sun of 1890 was the same street it had always been, and entirely different from the street where 2 strangers had sat in a waiting room 8 years earlier. And the limestone ridge to the north was the same ridge and entirely different for all the times they had ridden up it and sat on the outcrop and looked at the country. And the slow brown river to the south was the same river and entirely different for having been looked at from the ridge on the occasions that counted. In the evening of that day, Phineas and Ada sat on the narrow porch above the Courier office in the warm September dark, the children asleep inside, the press quiet below, the stars unreasonably bright above the Texas sky the way stars are in country with no competing light, and Ada said, "I have been thinking about Thomas and the type case. He'll be setting full columns by next spring," Phineas said. "I know. He has a feeling for it." She was quiet for a moment. "My brother had a feeling for it too. He used to say the type case was the most democratic thing in the world because the letters did not care who moved them, only how well. Thomas knows about his uncle. He does. He asks me about him sometimes. He asked last week if Thomas Mercer was the reason his name was Thomas." Ada looked up at the stars. "I told him yes, and that it was a good name to live up to, not because names have power exactly, but because having someone to remember makes you more careful about what you do." Phineas was quiet because that was the kind of thing that deserved to be received in silence. Then Ada said, more quietly, looking at the stars, "I also think about this sometimes. About you and me. About the fact that on a Tuesday morning in March of 1882, a doctor told you that I would outlast you, and instead of doing what most men would have done, which is to say nothing, or to back away from something that came with that kind of complicated mathematics, you looked at me across a waiting room and decided to stay. You told me to ask about willow bark tea," Phineas said. She laughed softly. "I did. It was excellent advice." "It was," he agreed. He reached over and took her hand in the dark, the hand with the faint, permanent ink staining at the fingertips that all the soap in the world had never quite fully cleared. He held it the way he had learned to hold it, with the precise degree of certainty that was neither grip nor touch, but something exactly between them. "Ada, yes, I would do it all again from the beginning, every single Thursday." She turned her head and looked at him in the starlight, and he could see the silver of her eyes in the dark and the quiet, complete happiness in them, the kind that is not performance and not sentiment but simply the truth of a life that has worked out as it should. "Even the broken roller bearing," she said. "Especially that," he said. "We fixed it." She turned back to the stars and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that on the porch of the building where the press slept, and the type case waited, and the week's story was always in progress, and the stars turned slowly over Dusty Creek and the limestone ridge and the slow brown river and all the country that was theirs, and everything was whole. Phineas Hudson had been told she would outlast him. He had looked at Ada Mercer across a waiting room on a Tuesday morning and said to himself that he had found his reason to last. 8 years later, on a porch in the dark with ink on her fingers and stars above the Texas ridge and 2 children asleep inside the building that held everything they had built together, he understood that both things were true simultaneously and that there was no contradiction in them. She would outlast him, and he had found in her the reason to make the most of every year between now and the one where that became relevant. And the most was a life so full and real, and deliberately built, that it had nothing left in it that was only passing through. He held her hand in the dark, and she held his, and the press waited for Tuesday, and Thomas waited to be old enough for the full column, and Clara waited to be old enough for the full ridge trail, and the Courier waited to be written, and the country waited to be stood on by grandchildren, and the stars went on being unreasonably bright above a small town in Texas, where 2 people had stopped and stayed and built something that would outlast them both, which was, in the end, the only kind of lasting that mattered.